The senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, there's a rather complicated issue that's out there that not many people are aware of. It emulates from back in 1996, the passage of something that was called the Communication Decency Act. Just a few weeks before the 2020 election, Twitter did what was previously unthinkable. It suppressed a long-standing legitimate news outlet, that was the New York Post, from sharing an article. Now, from sharing it either publicly or privately, it deemed unfavorable to presidential candidate Joe Biden. Obviously, they were concerned about Joe Biden, and they were using this act to suppress information that may not have been favorable. That's not what this thing is supposed to happen. It's supposed to do. To make it worse, they suspended an account of the Post, that's a major news outlet, for over 24 hours, while other big tech entities suppressed the story as well. The depths of Twitter's censorship reached new heights, telling users that sharing the article could be potentially harmful. Now, there's no criteria to determine what's potentially harmful. They just decide it's a liberal mindset, and they want to punish people who are not sharing their mindset. Now, you contrast that with the refusal to moderate any comments made by Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who called Israel a, quote, cancerous growth to be uprooted and destroyed, and for the elimination of the Zionist regime through firm armed resistance, despite having a policy against hateful conduct and glorifying violence. Now, that's what they did. Those are the words. That's what they did. And yet it proves that what President Trump has been talking about for a long period of time on the social media. Look what they've done to him over the last 4 years. It's time to make sure that Twitter and other social media platforms are held accountable for engaging in censorship by repealing Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Now, that sounds a little complicated. The Communications Decency Act, we know why it was started, but we know times have changed, and now it's turned into a very liberal political organization. Now, for 20 years, social media platforms have benefited from the protectionism unprecedented in the modern era, a complete liability shield protecting them for how they moderate or censor content posted for their users. To add insult to injury, there's no one to check the partisan censorship of these social media platforms. Instead, they're coddled by Section 230's Good Samaritan provision, which allows good faith efforts to restrict objectionable material. But the problem is, they're the ones who decide what is objectionable. We all know Jesus' parable with the Good Samaritan, the moral imperative that comes with the parable that has guided many legislative protections for those seeking to do good, doctors responding to problems with people in midair. I can remember many times I was involved as a volunteer pilot, helping to get people medical care, and for people that are trying to do the right thing. And we know that that's significant, and we know that was what the history is supposed to be on this section 230. It was intended to make sure that Twitter could flag and remove unquestionably harmful content, like ISIS in their propaganda videos. In the case of the social media platforms, however, it amounts to nothing more than the fox guarding the hen house. Instead of focusing on moderation to protect users from death threats or harassment and to prevent criminal behavior, Twitter is allowed to determine what is otherwise objectionable and censor it from the platform with no right to appeal and no transparency. I mean, where else can you go in America and find someone that's totally immune from that type of behavior? You can't. It doesn't exist. Now, this case in point, last year, they kowtowed to the Chinese Communist Party by removing the accounts of more than 100 dissidents ahead of the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square massacre. I remember that well. I remember where I was when that happened. but they didn't want people to know that that type of thing actually went on, and that was somehow objectionable. Twitter's censorship and actions over the past few years make it clear it's decided that President Trump is objectionable, and they decided that they're just going to act accordingly. And that's not surprising when you look at the employee culture that they have in that media. Here's the problem with Section 230. According to a strict interpretation of the 1996 laws, that's allowed. Partisan censorship is allowed. Senator Ron Wyden even admitted that when written, the Section 230 wasn't about neutrality and protecting the free marketplace for ideas and platforms. Clearly, we need to completely overhaul Section 230 of that act, and the best way to do it is just repeal it. Repeal the whole thing. That's what the president wants to do. That's the only. Then you can start over again and build up. Times have changed. The argument we hear against reforming alone, or repealing, would be that Section 230 is that any changes to it would give social media platforms like Twitter greater control over content and their platforms. I mean, they're not wrong. But that argument ignores the fact that censorship is already happening for Americans due to their political beliefs in violation of the First Amendment. It's supposed to protect people's without any transparency or recourse. Others believe that in the need for reform in reform in 230 incrementally, but those solutions are merely Band-Aids on a bullet wound. We've seen the negative impact of incremental reforms. They just don't work. A good example, efforts to hold users more accountable for information by requiring a real name associated with an account has seen Native Americans blocked from platforms for using their legal names. Social media platforms and supporters of Section 230's last-ditch argument to tell conservative voices to create their own social media platforms, since they clearly aren't welcome in those that are existing today. Well, that sounds good, except the problem is that the Twitter and others have a de facto monopoly on social media. House Democrats agree. They wrote a 400-plus page report arguing big tech constitutes a monopoly. And just remember the internet, what it was like back in 1996. In 1996, only 20 million Americans had access to the internet. Only 20 million Americans in 1996. Today it's 313 million Americans. And so now it's a way of life. The reality is that Section 230 is simply outdated for today's usage and is a strong case in why all laws should sunset. You know, one of the problems I have with laws that are passed, they can be passed, the problem is corrected that caused the law to be passed, but the laws stay on the books. And that's exactly what has happened with this. Section 230 is outdated and it needs to be changed. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves here time and time again forced to rectify decades-old laws with modern technology and ideas. So let me simplify. Section 230 allows Twitter and other liberal social media companies to be exempt from liability. In other words, no accountability whatsoever, exempt from liability for what their users say. For example, Twitter can't be held responsible for someone who posts a death threat against me, and I think that I understand that, and that's where we are today. But they are also protected what they censor, and even if it's in violation of the First Amendment or is protected speech. No one else has this shield. No one else in society has this, which is why President Trump is right. We need a total repeal. Now, if you look at what they had done in to President Trump over the last 4 years, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But the place for repeal is not the Defense Authorization Bill. There's an idea that the Defense Authorization Bill for 60 years in a row now has passed, and so everybody who has something that doesn't pass normally, they try to put it on as an amendment, having nothing to do with the military, nothing to do with our defense system for the ensuing year. And so that's how this one was, it was decided they could put this on. The problem is, if we had that language repealing it, we would not have a defense bill. So there's not a choice in this case. So we need a place for repealing the Section 230, and we need to do it. The NDAA's about making sure that our troops are cared for. It's for our kids in the field. They're the ones that we are supporting. They're the ones that need us. You know, if we don't have this defense authorization bill passed by December 31st, our pilots are not going to get flight pay. The kids are not going to get hazard pay. The whole thing will fall apart. You just think about the problems that we're having today in the military. One of the big problems is we don't, and the chair recognizes this because he's on this committee, and right now our big problem is how to get more pilots into the Air Force, into the services. And they can't do it because of the competition out there. We can't compete with the private sector. Now, if we take away their flight privileges, then it could be goodbye to most of our pilots. We just need to get this thing done. It should not be on the defense bill. And I want to make this appeal to make sure that no one has the idea that the NDAA is the place to have it. And I give the president and my colleagues my commitment that I'll do everything possible to work toward a complete repeal of Section 230 through other means. It's got to happen. And President Trump is right. Total repeal is the only answer, and we're going to make sure that we get this thing done. Not on the bill, not on the defense authorization bill, but in any of the other vehicles that come along. Got to be done, Mr. President. With that, I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.